So let's talk a little bit about zonal pressure diagnostics, about ZPDs. So today our conversation is going to be about these items. So we're going to talk a little bit about the benefits and limitations of zonal pressure diagnostics. If it's okay with everybody, I think from here on out I'm just going to sort of shorten that to ZPD instead of going through the whole thing. We're going to talk about best practices for accurate results. Best practices are basically some of the historically people who have done this many times or a few times that are really good at process improvement have figured out some sort of better ways to do it. So some process improvements. How to determine where to put the reference tube. We're going to actually be talking a lot about tubing. It's very important, obviously. We're going to talk about overcoming common mistakes, how to avoid those. And then we're going to be talking about how to interpret the result. So I want to get in first about the benefits of ZPD. So the benefits of ZPD, and we are going to talk about both sort of basic applications and advanced applications, but in general, the ZPDs are used to identify and measure leaks that pass through several zones, or some people would call them interstitial spaces, but today, if it's okay with everybody, I think we're just going to use the term zones. But we're going to talk about those leaks, how they pass through several zones in a building. They help ensure that there is no connection between living space and some of those little nasty parts of the building, the attics and the crawl spaces. Obviously, those connections are detrimental for comfort, energy efficiency, building durability, and indoor air quality. I'm sure you've all heard that, the old IAQ thing. So the thing about these benefits generally are applied to retrofit. I know that there is some new building. Is anybody out there using or have they used or know anybody that uses these ZPD in new buildings? Use your question panel, let us know. I think, Bill, you said you had a friend that was using it. Is he using
yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, what I see is not necessarily using a specific tool other than just basic zone pressure diagnostic. And really where I see it coming up in new construction is sometimes the sequencing of construction gets a little weird, and things get closed up before the HERS rater is able to look at all the spaces and check everything off on the thermal bypass checklist before it gets closed. So then what they're doing is kind of as a backup, it's going, okay, rather than tear everything open again so I can see it, I can test it. I'll use a zone pressure to show that what was supposed to be the air barrier to keep this, to keep from having a thermal bypass here is where it is by testing the layers leading up to that.
Thanks for that. So I know that you work quite a bit in weatherization. And that's where my background was. Now, one of the things that I think is very important, a great benefit, and probably one of the strongest, for me, one of the strongest arguments for ZPD is the implementation of ASHRAE 62.2 or ASHRAE 62.13, 62.10, whichever one it is. But I want to show you some pictures here. These are pictures of exhaust fans, bathroom exhaust fans, and how dirty they've become. So what does that have to do with zone pressure diagnostics? Well, these, the way that exhaust works, the way that exhaust ventilation works is that it's actually using or manipulating the pressure in the building or in the room to bring in fresh air. Now that's the problem, and so we say first do no harm in weatherization, right, Bill?
Correct.
But unfortunately, I think if you don't use ZPDs, or if you're not doing a very good job of air sealing, you might be sucking air that's supposed to be fresh air. You might be bringing in air from some of those nasty places, and I think that this is the evidence of some of this dirt and grime. I know a lot of this is just natural stuff from being a human, but I think, and I would tell you my opinion is that much of that stuff is actual nasty stuff that came from zones that we probably could have avoided if we had used ZPDs. Let's see that. So Bill mentioned, he mentioned 50 pascals of pressure, and I like the low tech part. But how do you get that? Well, you're going to need tools. Obviously, there are tools that you're going to need to enable you to actually run a test, to do the ZPDs. And first and foremost, you're going to need a blower door, because this is what we're going to use to actually create a pressure difference. So that 50 pascals that Bill talked about, and that could be a positive or a negative depending if you want to pressurize or depressurize. But you're going to need that, and depending on how the house is configured, you're probably going to need a good amount of tubing. So you need that blower door, you'll need that gauge, and you'll need that tubing to sort of set up the house as you would a normal blower door and test those. Question comes up, 1 gauge or 2. You can actually do this. You can definitely do this test with 1 gauge, but a lot of people find it easier to do it with 2 gauges. So here you have the Retrotec, the DM2 and the DM32. Now, Joe and I talked about this a little bit earlier, and Joe, what was your view on whether or not you needed 1 gauge or 2 gauge, or?
I guess whether or not you can afford it or if you have them. So a lot of people have a duct tester and a blower door, and they have 2 gauges. But some people, due to financial restraints or whatever, you can get away with 1 gauge to do a lot of that stuff. So you may only have 1 gauge. So a lot of things we're going to be doing today, we'll talk about that you have 2 gauges or you can easily walk around with 1 gauge. But in some of our explanations, we'll explain if you only if you have 2 gauges versus 1 gauge. So we're assuming you have 2 gauges, so you can make sure that your blower doors always staying at 50 pascals. We'll explain how to do that with 1 gauge also.
Exactly. So the idea being that we can use 1 gauge to run the blower door and do a reference from the fan to the outside to make sure that the house is depressurized at 50 and no environmental factors have changed that. Meanwhile, you can actually just move around freely with a 2nd gauge and take those tests intermittently. Bill, any view on that, perspective on that?
Actually, yeah, I like using 1 gauge. However, in many cases, I do teach using 2 gauges, simply because I like having that automatic control over the fan. That way, if something happens, if things change, that fan can still maintain that 50 pascals of pressure. When we start getting into more advanced diagnostics, we're going to be changing things around and always having to run back and readjust and make sure that we're still at 50 after we've made some changes can really add a lot of time and be inconvenient.
Exactly.
That's really the big one.
Yeah, and I know from my time in weatherization here in Illinois, when we were doing a lot of ZPDs on every house in every zone, it can be a lot of work to run tubing here and there, and then going up and down ladders and up and down staircases. So it made it a lot easier. But we will talk about two different perspectives on, especially when we talk about advanced diagnostics. I'll get to that later about how you can get around that. But I do want to mention now, I think it's germane to the conversation that I mentioned earlier before we started recording, that we are doing a trade-in program for our DM2s and for Energy Conservatory DG700s. Well, that said, we have a refurbished model for sale. I think Joe mentioned about if it's affordable. We have a refurbished DM2 model available. Joe, what does that come with?
You get in the DM, make sure, because you see the picture that the DM2 is on the left there. So you get that gauge, which can be used for just really simple basic diagnostics for this kind of stuff, or even CAS testing if you're trying to make sure you have an extra gauge around. So it comes with the rechargeable batteries, the charger, the case. And again, these are refurbished units, but they have a full warranty as though it was a new gauge. So
Right.
you definitely want to contact sales, because they are a really a lowball price in order to add an extra gauge to your kit.
Yeah, thank you. And that's the sales number there. So let's move on a little bit. Another thing that you're going to need if you're going to do these more advanced diagnostics, or if you're going to use what we call if you're going to test some of these modifiable zones, you're going to need a calculator tool. This is an example of a calculator tool. This was created by our friends over there at the Energy Conservatory, along with Anthony Cox, Colin Olson, and Cox. This is actually commonly called the Cox-Olson chart. And this is a chart that you can use. You can take some tests. This one has, there's two of these charts, one for opening the door from the garage to the outside and one from opening a door to the garage from the inside. You fill it out, and then you just sort of, figure it out from there. There's another calculator tool that they kind of built off of that one, and it's still back to Anthony Cox and Colin Olson. And this one's a little bit more colorful, a little bit more easy to use, and you can actually get it in a Excel spreadsheet form. So once you've got your results, you can go back to the computer and input them there. For me, and this is only my opinion, this is the tool that I choose. I think it's very easy to use. It is available for free at the Residential Energy Dynamics. Here's the link, and I think I already posted it out on the chat for everybody. I'll take you right there. It's a free tool. I think it makes the test itself a lot easier, and I will talk a little bit more about that towards the end. But I do want to move on. I want to get into some more important stuff here, or some other important stuff. So let's talk a little bit about setting up your gauge. Joe, did you want to take us through this, and I'll just work the.
Sure. Okay. So I tried to put as many gauges on here that most people would be familiar with. All gauges, as many of you know, but we are trying to make sure we cover the basics, because even when I first started learning, Bill could maybe remember back in those days when you first started doing this, that there's always these gaps that people really never explained a few things, So that each one of your gauges is really two gauges in one, that there's a reference and input for channel A, and there's a channel B. Most of the things we're going to be doing, you can use either one, but it's so much easier just to use channel A because it already is set up to read pascals, and that's really what I'm trying to read in terms of doing the zonal pressure diagnostics and the reading. So again, we have the DM32, we have the DM2, and we have the DG700. And just to kind of put everything in perspective real quick, let's launch a poll. We're going to do, what gauge do you have? Now, if you're getting your BPI credits or other CEUs, it is vital that you pay attention or chime in on these things. These actually confirm that you were here, you were participating, and they help your bonus score a lot. So I try and get up to at least around 80, 85. So we have a lot of people chiming in, and I did leave you the chance of saying, I have something different, and you can pick the bottom option. But these things actually, again, help your credit in terms of paying attention. So whether you have the Wi-Fi or not won't really matter in terms of the testing we're kind of do. There are some bonus features you can do if you have one gauge and you do have Wi-Fi. So we're about 83. Giving you, we're pretty good here. I'll give you for at least 45 seconds. So we're close.
Very interactive crowd.
Yes. Okay, we're counting down here. Less than 5. Last chance to vote. Appreciate everybody. Okay, I'm going to close the poll, and I'll show you the results. So we have an enormous amount of people that are using the DG700. We feel it's a great gauge. I think many of us have learned on that process also. And a fair amount of people that still have the DM2, and some people have the DM32. So it's kind of equal between having a Retrotec gauge or a energy conservatory gauge. So that helps me a lot in terms of what I'm going to explain.
Yeah, let's see if we can get back to that. Oops, sorry, hidden. And let's
Great.
think.
Okay, so now I know what kind of audience I've got when I'm talking about some of these connections. Okay, so each channel has its own input and reference. Okay, so the input is what I'm trying to read, and the reference is what I'm comparing it to. All right, so when I don't have a tube on the reference, it's just going to be comparing where the gauge is in my hand or where I'm standing in the house. All right, so most of us are going to put the blue tube on the input, and that's actually where we're going to be reading to, and the reference is, again, where we're standing. Next slide. Oh, you did already. So here's your readings you're going to get. I have XX because it depends on what you're reading or where you've connected your input tube to. So it could be 0. So for instance, if you just held the blue tube in your hand, not covering it, anything, and you stood in the hallway, you should be reading 0 pascals, because you're basically comparing, inside of the house to your reference of inside the house. So there isn't anything that's actually an external source or anything that's not right next to each other. right? So as soon as I put the blue tube in the garage or in the attic or connected to the crawl space, then I'm going to get a reading. It could still say 0, which actually, depending on where you're at, is a great thing. So we're going to be assuming that we do not have a tube connected to the reference. So the reference is always going to be the interior of the house, and we're standing in the house for a lot of the things that we're going to explain for the rest of this webinar. Next slide.
So, Joe, before we go into this one, actually, let's do another poll.
Okay.
Let's ask, so I think this poll, let's ask about, I want to ask you, get an idea of if you've actually done ZPDs or how frequently you do them. Because next up, I think for us is to explain sort of the steps of a ZPD.
So let me elaborate what a ZPD test could be. Actually doing a pressure pan while you have a blower door is a form of a ZPD test. It actually wants to find out if I actually do have kind of connections between the ductwork and the outside, depending on how your ductwork is set up, or what kind of leakage I have. Or some people will do the closed door test while they're running a blower door to see if this room or other rooms have a larger leakage. Again, while the blower door is running is the kind of the key to kind of isolating or determining other factors. So you know, you don't have to actually try and make sure you always have a connection to the crawl space to actually confirm you're actually doing part of a ZPD test. So I think you realize that after we go through the scenario that many of these aren't that difficult to set up or do, and kind of give you a confirmation as to how well the home is separated or sealed. All right, we got about 83%. We're going to close this down. All right, excellent. And we'll show you the results.
I think we both hit the button at the same time. Sorry about that. We did it again.
So we have a fair amount of people that are doing these kind of diagnostics regularly. So that's actually great to see. That I think those folks who do things rarely, I think you can find out that you could actually just easily grab your gauge and walk away from the fan if you have even just one gauge, and do some basic diagnostics to help confirm where your priorities may be, if there is any air sealing that's required, or if you're not meeting code. So the most common was people go do a code test and the builder's failing, and he wants to know where, and you're like, hang on, you can walk around with your smoke or the back of your hand, but just because air is coming out of the middle of the wall at the receptacle doesn't mean I know really exactly where it's coming from. So especially if there's a crawl space and an attic, now my goal is to try and see if I can't isolate where that larger connection is. Okay, so here's our basic setup. And I made the gauge larger and put it to the outer side here. But again, to confirm that we are standing in the house and the gauge is in the house, right? And we're going to have one blue tube that's connected to the input. And while the blower door is set to -50, this is a typical blower door setup, the same way you normally do a blower door. Reference tube is outside, everything else is set the same way. And I now have a second gauge that I actually am now walking around the house and doing my diagnostics. So the one thing that you want to, as a keynote here, we didn't really have a separate slide on it, is one of the things you can actually do is don't use set pressure when you actually going to do this type of test, and I'll explain why. That if you use set speed, and if you got our newsletter, we actually trying to explain to you what set speed was and what zonal pressure testing was. That if you use set speed, it's just like using the speed control on the fan, or the same way you do for energy conservatory. So what happens is that if somebody does open the hatch to the attic, it doesn't want to make up that space, and the whole process rev up, and then you close the hatch and it revs down, and the whole blower door falls on the floor. So when you use set speed, it actually will just maintain a speed for the fan, and you can get it to jog up or jog down with either the gauge itself. It's got little plus and minus to actually tune it right into 50 pascals. And now if I'm going to go to the attic and I open up the attic hatch, it won't actually affect the fan revving up and revving down. So that's one key thing to remember, is you can use set speed to kind of keep your fan at a balanced station. So here I opened the hatch, or I found a method. You can also take off a grill to a register, then confirm that A, it's sealed. So if it's sealed, I'm like, hey, that's great news. I need to find a better path to get into the attic, right? So many people just use the hatch. And there's different ways you can get little tubings or different connectors. We have some slides coming up to help you get into the hatch, close the hatch back up, and get these kind of readings. So again, I have all of my readings are going to be now focused on channel A. Channel B won't matter. It doesn't matter what kind of device I have, is we're only focused on channel A for the readings. Next slide. So what I'm trying to find out is when I do the blower door test and it's taking all of the air through the house, what are the connections to the attic? So I can now try and find out with my gauge as to what kind of connections there are, what type of air pressures may be between the attic and the main house, or even coming up the crawl space. Next slide. So here we have the blower door running. That's a constant that's happening for a lot of the tests we'll be talking about. All right. Keep going, Jay.
I am.
All right, so I got a pressure differential of 50 pascals, and I got channel A connected with the blue tube, and I can now actually check it between. So here we're trying to reiterate and make sure we focus on the input versus the reference. And one of the things that happens is that people forget, like, what kind of tube did they use or which one should I use? And the reality is it really doesn't matter. I mean, you could end up with numbers that are negative 50 or positive 50 or negative 27 or positive 27. It's just an absolute number. It just means that means that there is a connection, that 0 is inside the house and 50 is outside of the house. So the closer you are to 50 or negative 50, that's actually your number. So if you did make a connection that's incorrect, you ended up connecting it to the reference, it's not the end of the world. It's still just an absolute number telling me how connected the attic or other areas or garage or crawl space actually are. Okay.
Right.
So again, nothing's connected. I'm at 0.
Right. Bill, so we're talking about depressurizing here and referencing to the inside of the house. We had a little conversation about that before. Bill, what was your perspective on that?
So we like to use depressurization a lot because we're already doing a blower door test, and that's the basic single point blower door we're doing. And then I like using referencing the house. Seems to be pretty straightforward to people, but you can go the other way. You can pressurize it. You can use the outside as the reference. The key really is, we're looking at absolute values, and again, we've got that 50 pascals of air barrier, and we're just kind of looking for how much of that air barrier have we crossed. If we haven't crossed all of it, then there's leaks, there's pathways that we don't want.
Right. So by absolute value, it's basically the difference between 0 and a number. So negative 50 is an absolute value of 50, and 50 is an absolute value of 50 because you're 50 units or Pascal away from 0. Okay. Joe, you want to take it away?
Yeah, next slide. Okay, so this is the most common setup you'll use with any kind of a gauge. For the most part, you're going to use the input, and again, the reference is not connected. All right, keep going. So again, we went back to where we were, where we connected to the attic, and now I'm looking for a reading. So when the blower door is happening, then if I am at 50, then I know that the attic is in the outside or not connected to the interior, right? So the closer that number gets to 0, that means it's inside. So you could have a conditioned attic or an attic that's a sealed attic, and I would want that number to be closer to the interior or 0 itself. So the issue is when it becomes somewhere between 0 and 50. So again, to make sure we're on the same page, is we're only using the input, we're referencing the inside of the house, the blower door is doing its 50 Pascal depressurization difference, so that means that anything that's 50 is outside. So right now my attic is outside, and that's a great thing. It means I don't have a lot of connections between all the air penetrations. This is very rare that you would actually see these very clean, clear numbers as a full separation, but better builders and tighter homes are actually achieving these numbers.
All right. So this is a different result. Same test, different result.
So now I know that I actually have some connections, and I think you can hit the next button. It'll show you that somewhere I actually have some type of connections between either can lights or junction boxes or penetrations in the top plates that are now actually making interior connections from the attic to the inside. So the first one is go, okay, the attic has these problems. The next I can actually now do is kind of go around the house and see if I can't diagnose where these conditions may be, so I can focus on where to seal, versus just feeling as though I have to, start sealing everywhere. There are ways to now actually diagnose. Oh, I found this wall is an interior wall and it has the most connections to the attic, or these can lights clearly they're not airtight actually install. Next slide.
Okay. Now it looks like we're testing the crawl space.
That's correct, Jay. So again, your crawl space, if it is a vented crawl space, it is outside. And now we're going to find out what are the connections. Now, usually for a crawl space, there are some type of connections that exist between something that may be a grill or a vent or something that goes down to the crawl space, and you can usually take off a cover or find a pathway. Sometimes if there's a dryer, sometimes they'll actually go down the crawl space and vent out. You usually can find a little path around something that goes to the crawl space, identifying that this is obviously a leak, but also gives you the chance to make this measurement. So if it's 50, it's outside. That means I do not have any connections between the crawl space and the interior part of the house. Next slide. So now I'm at this stage where I'm like, wow, I'm at 20, which means I now have some significant connections. And now it's my goal to try and go around. A lot of times you can use your hand or a smoke pencil or pen to try and find some of this air movement that's occurring. Or again, I can actually now use a probe to go around and find some of these conditions. A lot of times below sinks where the drain is, because that drain is usually going down to the crawl space. So these are some of the paths that I could easily go around and identify and find them. Now, it could be that you also have connections that are on exterior walls. You could have a connection from the third floor that's actually connected to the crawl space. It doesn't have to be the bottom floor is your connection to the crawl space. It could be anywhere in the house because it's all on an equal pressure right now. So your goal isn't just to assume that it has to be on the bottom floor. It could be anywhere in the house that could have a large opening. And you can also have pathways that actually go from the crawl space to the attic that are showing you movements or allowing air to move throughout your interior walls, causing a variety of issues also. Next slide. See if there's another slide that goes along with that. Or it may just be a repeated slide. So if I have a 0, then I know that I did complete all of my air sealing. I'm good to go. And that's basically the underlying test procedure of trying to do a zonal pressure between the attic and the crawl space. It's the same concept with the garage. I mean, you could just imagine that I'm putting the tube underneath the door, make sure it's not pinched. I think Jay has some slides of something similar, and confirming how connected is the garage to the interior space. Next slide.
Any questions from anybody?
Someone did ask us, so if 50 means no connections and 0 is lots of connections. So again, confirming if your crawl space is outside or your attic is considered outside, so it means it's vented and it's that actually it's not an interior or conditioned crawl space or attic, so it is outside attic space. All right, so that means that 50 it means that it is outside, which it should be. And 0 means that it's connected. So it depends on what kind of crawl space you have, but assuming that's a typical standard U.S. home, it's open, and so it should be 50.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good question because when we were talking about this earlier, I was mentioning how confusing it can be for some people because when you're running the blower door with reference to the outside, you're looking at the inside as a 50 Pascal difference between the inside and the outside. But now, and this is why we kept showing that we had a 0 Pascal difference, or at least with reference to the inside. So now we're thinking of the house as 0. So we move from a blower door test where we're thinking of the house as being a 50 Pascal absolute pressure or 50 Pascal difference between the outside to now thinking about how a zone is in reference to the inside. So anything that is closer to 0, because the house is now inside, that's your reference, and reference is always 0, right? Right, Bill?
Correct. And I mean, the one thing I wanted to note here when we're talking about like whether the attic or the crawl space is conditioned and things like that, for those who are working in areas with much older buildings, we have the potential. I have the potential of walking into a building that's 400 years old here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and lots of things have changed. And where we want those air barriers to be, depending on what's happened to that building over the centuries, it changes considerably, and zone pressure can really help point out where is that air barrier, or is it where we want it to be, and if not, how are we going to get it to where we want it to be.
Thanks. Bill, actually, why don't you talk us a little bit through, here's a video.
Wait.
Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
When I first started doing this, I, like many others, were slightly confused, and I always would just take out all of the tubing from my gauge, and it'll read 0. Then I knew where 0 was. So if I knew that this is 0 when I stood in the house, then my goal was to try and find out what was connected or not connected. So if it was 0, then it was connected to the inside, and if it was 50, it was outside. So I could always just pull my tubes out and go, okay, this is 0, I'm inside, and then reconnect my tubes and realize that 50 is outside. So if you're not sure, just reset your gauge to just have no tubes, and that reminds you as to what's inside is 0.
Yeah. So what I was getting ready to segue into, if there's no questions at this point, is the fact that sometimes you do want to pressurize if there's suspect conditions in the house. Maybe any amount of environment there, or some sort of environment might make it so that you want to pressurize. With the energy conservatory fan, you have to switch tubes around. You have to change some things. But Bill made a video for us, and Bill, if you want to walk us through of how you can actually just do a pressurization test. So like we said before, we have been talking about depressurization, but you can do pressurization as well. So Bill, take it away. I'll hit play.
All right, so here we've got the test cabin basically set up in depressurization mode. I've just have the fan off. Everything's still connected. Release the fan, flipping it around just so that our output from the fan is now going to push into the house, creating positive pressure. Simply placing it back in the back in the hole, getting the tarp on there, strapping it back in, and this thing's ready to run. And I can literally walk over to the gauge from here and run it up to 50 pascals.
So is that going to change our pressure differential across the zones?
No, the holes are still the same, so it's still the same analysis. We're still looking at, these absolute values of 0 in the house if we're referencing the house, and 50 for outside.
So what are you doing here? You've got 2 gauges going.
I got 2 gauges going, so I was playing around with both setups where I had one gauge that was controlling the fan, and I was taking a tube to the different zones to test it. And then I was also trying it with a secondary gauge, which, again, much easier to walk around with that secondary gauge and just get our zone to the house reading rather than trying to run tubes all over the place.
Okay, so it looks like here you're actually taking us into testing a zone. You're testing a soffit here.
Yeah, so we went through and we had tested 3 zones on this place under depressurization. A drop soffit over some kitchen cabinets, an interior wall, and the attic plane itself, the ceiling. And basically what I was doing on this drop soffit was seeing, did they seal and on the back side there and avoid creating a thermal bypass, or is the drywall on the front of that soffit really our air barrier? And I found that in some cases our drywall was our air barrier, so they would not have met the thermal bypass checklist for one, and now we have wall cavities and lots of areas open to the attic that really shouldn't be, and can allow pollutants to move through, can allow attic air to move through there, and really cause some real comfort and energy use issues.
Cool. Good. Well, I think that works for me. Let's move back over to our our PowerPoint here. And what we wanted to do is, now that we've kind of talked about how to run the test, and we've talked about the differences between pressurization and depressurization, sort of how to interpret those results, let's talk a little bit about some of these references, about testing some of these zones, taking some of these single point test zones. Joe,
I got one question. Wait, I got one question that came out. So it was a great question from Howard. He goes, well, what's an acceptable number? Because we know we don't get exactly to 50. You know, how would you guys respond to what is 45, 47? You know, what number can you just accept? And let's just say that the home is 30 years old or less, so it's in that range of reasonably newer construction, but we did an air sealing and we confirmed that, you know what, I got as many things that I could diagnose, but the best I could do was a 45 Pascal difference between the interior and the attic, which is open to the outside.
So I can chime in here, Jay. In a well-ventilated space, like an attic or a crawl space with design ventilation there, 45 is really the lowest that we would typically allow in most programs that I get into. We really, in many cases, they're shooting for 48 that we kind of target. Now, when we get into spaces that don't have vents necessarily designed to the outside, then we're more accepting going down maybe to about 40 in cases like that, because there aren't big holes behind there. And really, when we're looking at zone pressures, it's really a comparison of holes.
Right.
The holes between the holes from the barrier to the inside of the house that you're testing across, compared to the holes that are behind it.
Right.
If it's really leaky behind it, then we should be able to get a really high reading. If it's relatively sealed back there and supposed to be, then we're accepting of some lower numbers.
Absolutely. I would say that the answer to that is definitely it depends. I do have a slide where we can talk about why it depends. But that's a great question. And Howard, if you're still a little bit confused, stick with us and I'll explain it a little bit more in depth. But yes, what Bill said is exactly right. We're only ever seeing the comparison between two holes. So overall, if your house isn't very leaky, if it's actually extremely tight, then that comparison but if and that zone is also incredibly tight, then we'll still see numbers that look like it's very leaky, because it's a reference we're referencing to. But if your house is very leaky and the zone is open, extremely open to the outside, then we'll still see some of the same numbers. And I have a schematic. I will show you that. Thank you for asking, and hopefully we can get to that. Joe, this is your house.
Yeah, this is my house.
What are these people doing?
I have a high ceiling, but it is actually directly connected to the attic, so it's not actually a
cathedral.
Cathedral ceiling, that's right. So that is on the other side of that. You can actually go in the attic and get to the can light, and that's on the other side of the pressure pan. So I did a training in my house for a group, and we wanted to try and find out if after they had air sealed, we did some diagnostics. So I said, okay, did you guys get to that can light? So I have a pole. In fact, this is a good time to find this pole because it actually is designed for people who put up Christmas decorations. You can get them at Walmart, Costco, and even on Amazon. It's like a 6 type of a pole that goes down to around 3.5 feet, but clearly goes up to almost I think 15 or 16 feet. So it allows you to do these large types of diagnostics. So we use this to find out, did it get sealed, the actual can light, or you can also use this to determine what kind of connections I might have in the attic, knowing that the can light is not sealed.
So this is interesting. So we've got a gauge here, and it's hard to see, but the tubing is connected here, and this is a Retrotec pressure pan. And so essentially what he's done is he's closed that. There's a can light behind there, so he's closed it up around that can light. So if that's open, if that can light is not perfectly sealed, then he can actually get a pressure reading as if he was sticking a tube in there, right? So he doesn't have
That's
to
right.
climb
So
up.
again,
Interesting.
That's right. So the blower door is operating at this time. So again, we're talking about a variety of diagnostics with the blower door running. One of the questions we've gotten several of is about people that want to keep asking about closing different bedrooms as a diagnostic tool, and what that can do is actually allow you to determine which room. So let's say I take one of the bedrooms, I close the door, and I can actually now throw my reference tube underneath the door and see what kind of numbers I'm getting, and that tells me that this room has more connections to the outside than potentially other rooms. So
Yeah.
there are ways, there's an enormous amount of things we can do in terms of diagnostics. So that is another tool you can do. But again, we're talking about the blower door operating while we're doing these tests.
Right, at this point, definitely. We will actually talk a little bit more about that. So if you're still interested in hearing that, we have a couple slides coming up. We're going to talk about that. But here's another kind of best practice. So what we have here is a gauge remote. That is a Retrotec app. It's for free. You can get it on that. Here we obviously have an Apple phone, so you can get it on the Apple Store. I think it's the iTunes Store. Excuse me, because I'm an Android guy. But you can also get it on your Android phone, or you can put it on your phone. And now, if you're in the attic, or if you're on top of a ladder and you only have one gauge, you can connect to that gauge, and you can see what the readings are and make sure that your fan is still running at 50 pascals. Here's another best practice. This one is from our friends over there in the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation. Markham, great dude. If you're out there, well, I'm sure you're not because you're retired. But great guy, and this is one of his hacks. And basically what we have here is we've got an hacks. If you're not from, I guess that's sort of an American euphemism, but if you don't know, that means that's a smarter way of doing something that somebody figured out a way to do it. So basically what he's doing here is he's just added a piece of a probe, some type of harder tube, to his current tube, and he's pushed it around the boot, and this is on the floor. So what we're seeing basically on the other side of here is the crawl space. So now again, running the house at 50 pascals with reference to the outside, and now he's finding out reference to the inside. So the garage, obviously, the garage is a very common. It's a very common zone that we test. It's important because if you have a car in there, it's probably going to be creating carbon monoxide. If you've got a car in there, you've probably also got some other types of fluids, your paints and your VOCs and all kinds of nasty, dirty bits in there that we want to keep out. But of course, we want to be able to physically get in. So another little trick that a lot of people do is take brake wire. So you can get this from an automotive store. It costs practically nothing. You can get long bits of it, and you can twist and bend this into any configuration, and then stick that into your tube so that you can actually close the door on it. So once you got that door closed, you can get your readings. Joe, do you have any other tricks, any other types of tubing or anything you know of, or any ways of in your toolkit that you want to share with these guys?
Wait, I got a couple comments. So you can also go to auto store, brake line, something a lot of people use. And some people asked about, well, you just made everything smaller, and the reality is it still picks up pressure. It actually doesn't restrict or reduce the pressures that you're reading. A lot of people just use the quarter-inch tubing only because of how it fits with the gauge, and it does well to not get blocked easily versus the smaller tubing. Someone asked about the garage, since you're doing the garage, Jay.
Yeah.
They wanted to know, should you leave the overhead door opened or closed? And I responded to them or everybody that you're really trying to test normal operating conditions. So I want to find out what's happening with the garage down. If I opened it up, it really will obviously be an outside condition. But my goal is to try and find out what are the connections with it closed. If you want to try and confirm that, you can open it up, slightly or half, and it definitely is going to be an outside number. But my goal is to try and find out what happens when it is closed itself.
Right. This type of test, and we're still talking about a basic ZPD where we just want to know the relationship between a zone and the inside. Well, yeah, definitely we want to make sure that the door to the garage is closed and the door from the garage outside is closed. However, I will in a moment mention some other tests where you will want to try and open both doors. either simultaneously or individually. But that's a really good question. Yeah, definitely, Joe is absolutely right. We want to make sure that that is closed outside door for this type of test to see the relationship. Because if you open up that door, it's going to be open to the outside, and it's going to give you your reference, or your when you're comparing the leakage between the inside of the house to the garage, and you're comparing the leakage, that leakage to the garage to the outside. Now that comparison, because of that big amount of leakage from the garage to the outside, is going to be unrealistic. So now that I've made that more confusing, let me move on. Another quick one, partition walls. Bill, for lack of time, I'm going to skip the video about the partition wall, but can you tell me why anybody would want to test these interior, partition wall being an interior wall? Why would we want to take pressure samples from inside of a wall, from an inside wall?
Because what we can see is if that interior wall finish is acting as our air barrier, or our primary air barrier, so we're getting readings closer to 50, that means we've got openings to our attic, to our crawl space, to all these nasty places. And even though we may not see leakage there, much leakage there through the blower door, this is a quintessential a thermal bypass that can cause a lot of energy movement out of the house or into the house that we don't want. It's always going the wrong way on us. So we can really see, did we get that top plane and bottom plane sealed? If we didn't, we'll see higher numbers on this interior wall. It means we've got some work to do.
Right. Good answer. Another thing that we can actually
wait,
do.
I need to go back to that slide. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem.
So, so the picture on the left is something that I don't recommend, nor is Retrotec supporting. You can do it, but I usually tell people to try and find something that's not an electrical outlet and putting a metal probe next to it, only because of the obvious risk factors that go along with that. So if you are going to do that, you can see on the left they just drill a very small, tiny hole, which usually is somewhere where nobody notices, or find something else where you can penetrate the wall, like this these heating, plumbing systems that they have here. But there are things that deal with either internet or cable that are a much safer resource to try and do that. The other thing to remember is that some of these walls, if they're more than 8 feet, they may have fire blocking, which means that they have framing in the middle of the wall that kind of really restricts or can actually not allow you to confirm that you're connected to other parts of the attic. So if you really have tall walls, you sometimes may want to check the lower or upper sections to find out what your connections are.
Definitely, yeah, 8 feet tall, absolutely. Yeah, in fact, so yeah, Joe, as Joe pointed out, and so definitely pointed out in the video that was made by the Alaska Finance Corporation, I said two things. One, never use an electrical box to get a reading, never. And two, if you're going to use this hole, make sure that you're putting your probe outside of the box. So this outlet or switch is going to be inside of a box, and make sure that you're outside of it. But as Joe mentioned, that's definitely not the recommendation of Retrotec. We recommend that you safety first. So, and
there's lots of plastic tubes like WD-40 little red tube it has, or there's variety stuff out there. If you're going to do that, just don't use a metal tube.
Yeah, definitely good point, Joe. And if and if any, yeah, definitely, and don't let your kids do that. So you can also just use Zone Diagnostics to find an air barrier. Now this is actually really important if you're, especially when you're getting ready to do some air sealing. So what we have here, Joe made this little schematic, but basically what we have here is this pink line. So this red line is the outside of the house. This pink line here is the thermal boundary. That's where the insulation or some sort of insulation is. And then this blue line is actually the pressure boundary. So now what we've done, going into this house, we've depressurized and we've got our tube stuck past the drywall, and this is sort of the gypsum and drywall. And we're coming up with a 50 on channel A. So the results are 50 Pascal. So if the inside, with reference to the inside of the house, is 0, and reference to the outside, or reference to this area, is 50, now we've determined what? Anybody? Right, we've determined that the air barrier is here. So now I know that if I'm insulation and air sealing guy, I actually want to move this. I want to move the insulation over here because we want these to be continuous and contiguous, right? So I might be testing and I get now, see the results are the opposite. It is a 0. So that means that my air barrier is actually here. So in this case, I actually want to move this air barrier back, either reapply this drywall or open it up and apply some sort of air barrier material. This is really in my part of the world here. I'm in Chicago in the Midwest. We see a lot of story and a halves. I know in the Northeast they do. They have their Cape Cods. We've got our finished attics. But this is especially helpful if you're going to retrofit one of these homes and you're trying to decide if you're going to insulate at the roof deck or behind the knee wall. And that's all I want to say about that. So we are I think past time now. So this is extra time. Please stick around. If you can't, we totally understand. Thank you. If you've met your if you've been here the whole time, then you'll definitely get your CEUs. But if you want to stick around, thank you so much. We're gonna carry on. And this is extra time, and we will give you some time at the end here to answer some questions if you have them. So I want to talk a little bit about modifiable versus non-modifiable zones. So that term, I learned that term from Rick Karg. And so what does it mean? Well, modifiable, we've talked so much right now about these sort of basic reference tests that are usually applicable to non-modifiable zones. So what is a non-modifiable zone? Well, a non-modifiable zone is a zone where you can't add a hole, right? So these are commonly cantilevered floors. Usually don't have I shouldn't say you can't, without being destructive. So there's not already some sort of hatch, door, or opening to it. Cantilevered floors, the soffit. So we in the video that Bill showed us, he had a soffit where he had drilled holes so that he could actually take a test. Part of that is because he didn't have a door. So that was a non-modifiable space. Side attics without access, even crawl spaces without access. These are what we would call non-modifiable spaces. And those types of spaces, or zones, are the kind that we're only going to be able to do these sort of rudimentary tests. But when you have a modifiable zone, the modifiable zone, we can actually do advanced CPDs. And when we do an advanced CPD, and that would be, examples would be attics with a hatch, attics with a gable vent, crawl space with a hatch, a side attic with an access, a garage, of course. A garage, if you have a garage that is a non-modifiable space, I would definitely go to your builder and say, this is not a good garage. So the point is that these are areas or zones where we can actually open up a hole, and then when we can do that, when they're modifiable, we can do a whole different battery of tests. So I want to talk a little bit about, really quickly, why you would do it in a piece of advanced diagnostics. Now this goes back to a question that we had earlier from Howard, and I don't know if Howard's still on. I hope you are. So Howard, this is a image I got from Rick Karg, who is with Residential Energy Dynamics. Great stuff. Check out their website, residentialenergydynamics.com. So what he's showing us here is really what we're seeing when we're talking about ZPD and the ZPDs that we've been talking about. So here we see these imaginary 4 holes that are on the roof, and they're all about this size, right? And then we see these 2 imaginary holes that are on the ceiling or the attic floor. So we'll just call this the attic floor, and we'll call this the roof, if that's okay with everybody. So here we have the blower door running, where we've depressurized the house to -50, and the test that we get when we do a zone to the inside is 37. And the readings that we would get with the zone to the outside are 13. Because remember, there's if we take a test from a zone with reference to the inside, the difference between that number, 37, or whatever number we get, and 50 is going to be from that, through that pressure barrier. So the point is, let's just talk about this. Let's just look at it from this perspective. So this is the example that we got. So we were doing with reference to the inside, and we got a 37. So watch what happens now. Now, in my imaginary situation, I take those original 4 holes and I make them enormous. I make them giant. And I take those original 2 holes in the ceiling, or I'm sorry, in the attic floor, and I make them equally gigantic. And look what happened. You'll notice here that we still have the same numbers. We're still getting a 37 Pascal on our with reference to inside. So Howard, earlier when you asked what's a number that what's an acceptable number, well, this is sort of your answer. I don't think there is really an acceptable number because again, all we ever know in this non-modifiable zone test, this basic ZPD test, is what the relationship is between these holes with the holes in the zone to the outside in relation to the zone to the inside, or with reference to the indoors. Okay, so here's a little chart to maybe help you make sense of that. So essentially, if we have, these are the zone pressures that we would be getting. This one was the house to the zone, and this one is the zone to the outdoors, depending on how you tested it. You only need to do one of these tests. But you'll notice that these always add to 50. So if you do one of these, then the difference between 38 and 50, because we pressurize the house to 50, is 12. And then here is sort of our ratio, the relative size of leaks. And this is when we can figure out if the number is acceptable or not. So we'll use this column to talk about some of the tests that we did. So we'll take Joe's example about testing the crawl space. He tested the crawl space zone with reference to the house, and he got a 12. Then that means that the remaining 38 is the zone to the outside. So then our relative size of the leak with the house to the zone is 2 to 1. Now, and then the zone to the outdoors is always going to be 1 to 1. So we don't really, not too concerned about this, but 2 to 1. So what we're saying is that the amount of leakage from the house to the zone is half of the zone to the outdoors. So Joe, is that good or bad?
It depends. How big are those holes to the outside? Because we have half the size of that basically going to the inside.
Right.
So if those holes are really big to the outside, those holes coming in are half of really big or still pretty darn big. If the holes to the outside are small, then half isn't a big deal. But the problem we have is we don't necessarily know, and that's where getting into more advanced diagnostics makes sense.
You know, the one place where you kind of could get a ballpark as to what is your outside connection is a crawl space, where I understand my known vents. I understand that there's restrictions with the actual what kind of material may be covering those, but you kind of can, it's a lot easier than trying to do the attic as to what are my gable venting or ridge venting, or the crawl space can sometimes give you a better chance if you're trying to understand the concept. You can take time on your own house sometimes to maybe do that, or one house that I can actually add up that, because I go, wow, this is actually a known number, and I can now actually go, wow, if I know this hole for the crawl space and this is my number, I could actually use that at percentage to be a factor.
Exactly, and that's because those zones are modifiable. So that means that I can, if I have a vent from a zone to the outside, or if I have a door to the outside, or if I have a door to the inside, regardless, there are some tools that we can actually use because those zones can be modified. So the point is that now that we can actually modify, and again, meaning that I can open a door to that zone, or I can open a hatch to that zone, or I can open from the house to that zone, or I can open a hole from that zone to the outside, and I know the size of that hole, then I can do all kinds of things. So Michael Blasnick, Anthony Cox, Colin Olson, Jim Fitzgerald, these guys did a lot of testing, and they developed some great great calculation tools and some great methodologies that we talked about earlier. You might remember earlier I showed you some calculation tools that they built. Well, those are all dependent on the fact that you can do exactly what Joe said. You can actually open up a hole, and sometimes you need to measure that hole. So there's some of these, if you open it to the inside, that's what we call the add a hole method. I know Bill teaches that. If you can open a door to the inside, usually for the garage, you can do the open a door method. There's the leakage area matching method, which is something I think Joe was intimating about. Any method where you can create a sizable change in zone pressure from one state to the other. And that meaning, what I mean by that is, here you'll see that I'm testing this garage with the door shut, and now I'm going to get a pressure. This is closing the air barrier that Bill indicated earlier. But now I open up that air barrier, and what I'm going to see on my gauge is that there's a giant difference in pressure. Now I can take those two readings and I can compare those using a tool to find out flow or equivalent leakage. And that's important because before, all we were talking about was a difference in pressure, and we couldn't indicate. And so again, back to Howard's great question in our discussion about it depends on that simple zone diagnostics, because all we could see is pressure, but what we couldn't see was flow or equivalent leakage. We couldn't talk about how much air, the volume of air that's moving through there, or the hole that the air is moving through. So this is where we can actually use this to get a better estimate. And basically, any one of these tests, what you're going to do is you're going to do a test with that zone closed, and then we're going to modify it or open it either to the inside, indoors, or to the outdoors, and then we're going to take another reading. And then we're going to take those readings and we're going to put them into our tool. Now, I mentioned earlier that I wanted to talk about the tool that I like the best, and this is the tool that I like the best. This is a free tool. I sent you a link to it earlier. This is Residential Energy Dynamics. It was created by Rick Harg, a great guy and a very smart guy. And this tool has some bells and whistles and makes it, but more than anything, this is useful for a person who is actually in the field testing. It makes it so this is one of those things where you can get better results, more accurate results, and you have to work less. Anytime you show me one of those things, I'm fully behind it. And that's my personal opinion. So this is basically what the entire tool looks like. You'll find this right on the website. This is a web-based tool. And then all you really have to do is just run those tests and put this information in. And it's very, very self-explanatory. So you'll see at the top, it's going to ask you your zone tested, and that's because you can actually print that information out. Again, but another thing that makes this very easy is if I'm doing any testing, it's because I'm collecting information that I need to communicate to somebody. So I can print it to a piece of paper, or I can print it to a PDF and email it, whatever it is. But this test doesn't live in a vacuum. It's for me to actually communicate something. Important, now I can use a drop-down menu. I can click pressurize or depressurize. There are some advanced inputs, and essentially this is going to make sure that you're even more accurate. And those advanced inputs are generally things about what's going on in the environment, whether it's a big pressure difference because of a heat difference between the inside of delta T, difference in temperature between the inside and the outside, or maybe it's windy. And those things can affect it. And I'm not going to go into why, but take my word for it. I'm an expert. But then you can all you basically have to do is fill these in. So here is your house with reference to the outdoor. This is the house with reference to outdoor, and that's with the blower off. You'll just take that right from your gauge and put it in there. And this house with reference to the zone, you see that you have a drop down. You can actually do it with the zone to the outside. You put that in there, and then when you do it with the blower door on, and it's going to give you the delta pressure. You can use this drop down for our friends who don't use the imperial system. This is all it can get any kind of results and all kinds of metric or imperial stuff. Great thing is you'll see up here it says that click the label of any input or result for a pop-up to help. So if you're trying to figure out how to work this stuff, you just sort of linger over it. And of course this isn't a live picture, but if you linger over it, you're going to get a pop-up and it's going to tell you what that's used for and how to fill it out. Another thing that this will do is this will actually, this is really good about indicating while you're in the field, while you're doing the test, this will tell you if something's wrong. So we talked about this earlier, that you can depressurize or pressurize. If you're going to do that, when you put your numbers in, you have to make sure that you put a positive or a negative number, or else it's going to pop up and tell you, if you said you depressurized and you put a positive number in there, it's going to tell you that something's wrong. All right, so I'm going to kind of move to the middle of this tool. Here's where you get into the modified zone configuration. So now we've opened a door or some kind of opening to the inside or the outside, and see we have a drop-down menu for that. Here we can talk about that sort of modification. Great thing about this is you don't need to know the size of that hole. With many of those other calculations, you actually have to measure that hole, or you have to only open it a little bit until as you watch your gauge as it equals out to 0. So this is what I mean. This makes this even easier. So basically, all you have to do is sort of run the test once with the door closed, and run the test the second time with the door open. Can be to the outside or to the inside, and then you put those readings or those pressure differences and the blower door numbers into this thing, this guy right here. You can do it for multiple zones, and then when you're done, all you have to do is run, and you run your results, run your report, and you can print that out. So this can be used. This can be useful for a whole slew of things. You name it, air sealing, making sure that your air sealing is done right, for monetizing air sealing for some of you that are in programs, for making sure that for some of you that are contractors or that are running crews, making sure that you're air sealing at the right place, and that you're as you'll remember some of those dirty exhaust vents that we showed earlier, that you're not endangering people's the indoor air quality that people have. I was going to bring up some other resources and share those with you. There's been a lot of great articles, a lot of great information written about this. I'm going to send some of that stuff out here on the chat for you. So Bill, can you see any of these questions? This is a great article, probably one of the main ones I think that I like to reference. Very clear, by David Bohack. I believe David Bohack is from the Wisconsin. I think he might be from WEC, or he might be from one of the other, the Center for Energy and Environment. This is a great one. This explains really well. Here is another presentation by Rick Karg. This is a great one. I also reference this one as we talk today. And I think I've already sent out our link to to residential energy dynamic. So
I got a couple for you. Bill, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm still here, but I got to run in a moment.
Okay, got it. Right. So here's your last question then. If attic to the house difference is 35, and then I air seal the floor over my vented crawl space, would the 35 Pascal difference in the attic change, even if I did not do any air sealing in the attic plane?
So if the attic was connected, it was connecting to the crawl space, which it certainly can through those interior walls, then we would see a difference. If we don't see a change in the attic after air sealing the floor between the crawl space and the house, then we can assume that there were basically no connections between the attic and the crawl space.
All right, and yeah, Howard, we can definitely follow up after. Howard has multiple questions, so we can follow up after this. So, Bill, we appreciate your time. If you got to go, we totally understand.
Yep. Thank you for having me. You can catch me by email if you need to for any of the other questions. Thank you everybody for coming today. Looking forward to doing another one in the future.
Thanks a lot, Bill.
Yeah, Joe. So I've got my question panel open. Let's go through these questions. Do you want to answer them if you can?
Yeah, there's one from Howard, or another from Howard if you want to go for that one.
Okay, and if anybody wants to leave or needs to leave right now, thank you so much. Before you leave, I just want to say thanks again. It was great. Thanks, Bill, so much for joining us. Always great to work with you. So let's see if you, the question, oh, here it goes. Jeez, there's a lot of questions.
when doing the add a hole, can you want to grab that one?
Sure, I'm just looking for that one. Let's see.
Close to the
Doing that, okay. When doing an add a hole test on crawl with only access door in the foundation wall, can I open that access door to get the results in red? Yes, you can. Simple as that. Just choose, there is a drop-down menu for that, and just choose, that's the door. And you don't, again, you don't even have to say what size it is.
So wait, so let's elaborate on that, because one of the things you've done is you went outside to do that, and as long as you then added tubing back to the inside of the house, you could actually do that from outside. So there's multiple ways to be creative about these, or you can even use your phone or a tablet to actually remotely read what's happening inside the house.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. That's a good point. That is a great point. This is one of those examples where you would really only want to use one gauge, because and then you can have your channel A. Now we were using channel A where we were just using it for house pressure. We could use that channel A to keep the house at pressure. We're going to walk outside, and then we could use channel B. We could actually stick channel B, the input. We could take that out. And all the way outside through the panel, and then stick it in the zone from the outside. And using, like Joe said, using gauge remote on any kind of mobile device, you can see your results on your gauge inside the house. And you can make sure that fan is. In fact, you could turn that fan off while you walk out the door, that outside door. Shut that outside door, then turn the fan back on, bring it up to 50, and then get your results. So, yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Joe. Doesn't reducing pipe diameter by adding a smaller tube reduce the airflow? I think, Joe, we talked about that. You mentioned it, but yeah, just to get back to that, the question here is when we were taking those very small tubes, the copper tubes to get the pressure. I think that this is a very good question, because this, I think, indicates a misconception that I've run across many times training all over the world about what a manometer actually does. A manometer or a gauge actually only tells you the difference in pressure. So it's that digital part that extrapolates flow, or with the DM32 equivalent leakage or air changes per hour. But it doesn't. So yeah. So does it reduce the airflow? There is no airflow. That's really important. In fact, we don't want any airflow, because it's a pressure test. It's not an airflow test. So, or I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. It is an airflow test, but that airflow is extrapolated. So that pressure tube is exactly as it says. It's a pressure tube, not an airflow tube. Really good question. Um, So yeah, Howard, you're asking, since we're in free time. Howard's another question. Retrotec website only offers a list of testers doing commercial and clean agent testing. Have you considered as a residential testers? That's on a different part of the site. So we do have a residential one, correct, Joe?
No, it's not yet.
It's
We're
not.
working on that, actually, Howard. So that's our goal, and we're in stages on how to do that. So you will be, at a time coming soon, be able to go to Retrotec and actually have yourself listed as a residential tester that's on there. So thanks for noticing that, Howard.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry. So let's see. If any other burning? I'm trying to go through these questions. If an addict's at the house, we've already answered that one. Uh, so Joe, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll ask one for those of you that are still hanging around. We still got a good number of folks out there. So for those of you that were stating earlier that, no, I rarely do this kind of stuff, can you give us some feedback as to whether or not we actually just confused you and you're still not going to do this, or if we were able to try and give you some guidance as to how these tests actually can be done and that they're not that complicated. So I usually, am blunt and shoot straight forward. That is that you do not need any of the graphs or the charts that Jay will send you a link to, right? You do not need to use the red dynamic tool to do a good zonal pressure diagnostics. They are a great feature especially once you understand the numbers, they can tell you a lot of detail about what your readings are. But you can do everything you need to do with literally just one gauge. Or if you have two gauges, it just makes life a lot easier. But you can actually determine if for an existing house is what this is most commonly used for. But again, for a new house, I can tell how connected the attic is to the interior. And if I do the garage, mostly it's also focusing on the walls that are adjoining that same space from interior to garage or crawl space. I can really determine where the house is failing and where I should be focusing on. So once I know the main area to focus on, now I can go around and find individual areas to try and probe to determine where the air sealing did not occur. So hopefully we're able to enlighten you that these are actually not overwhelming tests to do. And if you're doing a pressure pan, you're already understanding the concepts that when you have a pressure pan over a duct, when you have the blower door and you've got numbers above 2, closer to 5, you have significant leakage from the outside that's moving into the ducts and into your register and shows up on your pressure pan. That's the same kind of concept that you're dealing with here. Now I'm actually just going to use the gauge in a probe or gauge in a tube, and I can go around the house and actually try and find the focus for air leakage.
Yeah, I think, Joe, you made a really good point earlier when you said that that duct testing is basically just another zone test. Except for with that zone test, we just want to make sure that that zone is in. With the other one, we want to make sure that it's out. So I
Yeah,
think
you
that's
may,
great.
yeah, for the pressure pan, right? Huh?
So
Right. So yeah, go ahead, Jay. We knew this one would most likely go over,
mhm.
and we had lots of great questions and great feedback from a lot of you. And again, if you do not get your questions answered, you can send it to training@retrotec.com. We can clarify. This was recorded, and it usually takes us anywhere from I say a week safely because usually we do it in a couple of days, but our goal is within a week we can get this up and running, and you'll find it on YouTube.